What does source A suggest about Lloyd George's attitude towards French security? First of all, Lloyd George believes that Britain and the US should guarantee protection to France against a German attack until the League has proven its authority and efficiency. He states that this should be done because France has been attacked twice in half a century. Lloyd George justifies his claims by saying that the US and Britain should protect France since, quote, France has long been a guardian of a liberal and democratic civilization against autocracy in Europe.
Compare and contrast the views expressed in sources C and D about French security. Source C suggests that the French security is currently at stake in terms of what the French Prime Minister Edward Herriot mentions in the source. This is shown as he says the following: "My country has a dagger pointed at its breast, within an inch of its heart." This shows that he is concerned of his country security, and that at any time the whole French nation could collapse. This shows that source C supports D, in the way that it shows how the French are alone and do not have any foreign support as they should have within the League of Nations. This is supported as source D says: "The United States and Britain had left France and the sole guarantor of its own security." In terms of the differences of these two sources, you can argue that source D shows the fear of foreign countries, and this becomes a reason of why the French remain alone in terms of their security. This is shown by source D as it says: "For British public opinion was increasingly fearful of being drawn into another war by French aggression." Another contrasting factor, which is shown by source D, is the failure of the Americans during the Anglo-American Guarantee as a result of the moderation of the Treaty of Versailles policies against the Germans, which the French disliked. This is shown as source D mentions: "The failure of the US Senate to ratify the Treaty of Versailles also meant the collapse of the simultaneous treaties that provided for automatic US and British aid in case of a German attack."
With reference to the origin and purpose, assess the value and limitations of source A and source C for historians studying the Anglo-American Guarantee. Source A. It is an extract from the Fontainebleau Memorandum on the 25th of March 1919, written by David Lloyd George, which was the British Prime Minister at the time. In here, Lloyd George intends to address to the international audience to show his intentions to back up and support France once the League shows to be effective. And the value of this source is that it is a first-hand account of Lloyd George's intentions. It also occurs in 1919, which is during the peace conference in Versailles. However, its limitation is that the policies mentioned by Lord George were never carried out due to the failure of the US Senate to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Now, moving on to source E. Source E is an extract from a book published in 1986 by a professor of international relations at the London School of Economics. Its purpose is mainly to inform about the role of the League of Nations in international affairs, and the value of this source is that it comes from an expert in the field of international relations. Therefore, it is reliable since the person has large knowledge about the topic. However, the limitation is that it was published in 1986, which means that it is based on opinions from other sources, and it is also far away in time from the real events. And also, The main focus of the extract is not about the Anglo-American guarantee, but the League of Nations in general.
We have the final question, which goes as follows. Using the sources and your own knowledge, analyze the consequences of the failure of the Anglo-American Guarantee on international relations between 1920 and 1926. First of all, source A mentions the reasons why there should have been a successful agreement between the British and the US with the French in terms of a possible attack of the Germans in a near future. The source also mentions how the League of Nations is still not at its best point, and until the League is in no position to prove its effectiveness, there should be an agreement between the three powers. Here we can see that this source is suggesting that because of the League of Nations' lack of action towards a possible attack of the Germans, it puts both the US and the British in the manner to help the French, since they have already been invaded in the past. This is shown as it says, until the authority and effectiveness of the League of Nations had been demonstrated, the British Empire and the US ought to give France a guarantee against the possibility of a new German aggression. Source C as well as Source A, they do not come together in the way that the British and the US should guarantee their support in case of a German aggression. Source C, throughout a conversation by the French Prime Minister Hériot and the British Prime Minister Macdonald, they discuss of the French situation against the Germans. Hériot expresses himself with Macdonald and lets him be aware of the current position of the French and how they have a dagger pointed at its breast within an inch of its heart, which shows how the French are at stake by the Germans. However, the British do suggest that they will do as much as possible to avoid a future discontent and even worse, cause a war with the Germans. Nevertheless, source C, through Mr. Macdonald, it mentions that he will not provide any sort of military aid to the French. Source D, again to a certain extent, does agree with the idea that both sources A and C suggest of how the US and the British are not willing to support the French through military means in case of a sudden German aggression. This is shown as source D says. The United States and Britain had left France the sole guarantor of its own security. However, source D takes us back to the Treaty of Versailles and its policies. The source mentions specifically how the British and the US had promised to the French to protect mutually in case of a future German aggression, and because of this the French had not been that harsh on the consequences to be said to the Germans. Once the French knew that both nations would not stand alongside the French, they felt betrayed and in fear. Finally, source E also agrees with the rest of the sources. This is because it shows and confirms that the fact that the French had been left alone by the British and the US with no support in case of a German aggression. The source, however, also expresses the view that the Americans, without them joining the League, it was since then that the French started to feel uncomfortable and also started to fear even more a possible uprising by the Germans in the future. This is shown as the source says. With the resulting failure of the nation, the US, joining the League, France considered the Covenant to be too weak to defend her against the German aggression. In conclusion, all sources come together in the way that they all support the idea that the French were left alone and unarmed against the Germans, who would possibly carry out an act of aggression towards the French, seeking revenge for the policies imposed to them in the Treaty of Versailles. On the other hand, the sources also had a different point of view, other than the failure of international relations involving the French, the British, and the US. This can be seen as the possible failure of lack of effectiveness of the League of Nations, and also the possible betrayal of the British and US towards the French after the Treaty of Versailles. Overall, they all agree on the same factor, that the French were left unprotected and left as an easy target for the Germans.